Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about taxpayer subsidized health care for non-citizen migrants, a bipartisan verbal lashing for the state's child welfare agency, and updates on Illinois' gun ban registry. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. Just 4 months into the fiscal year, Illinois' health benefits for Immigrant Seniors program will suspend accepting new enrollees starting November 6th. That's according to the Illinois Department of Healthcare and Family Services. Cost projections for the 2024 fiscal year were at nearly $1 billion. For the fiscal year that started July 1st, legislators budgeted $550 million for the benefit. Tuesday, an official from the Department of Healthcare and Family Services told the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules that the agency was not ready to implement cost-saving co-pays for non-citizens enrolled in the program and that there were 16,100 enrollees. Thursday, the Pritzker administration announced with the capacity of 16,500 nearing, the state will suspend taking non-citizen enrollees after November 6th. The department said that it will further monitor the program. Meanwhile, there's bipartisan disdain for the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services for how the child welfare agency is impacting daycare service providers. Last summer, the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules suspended a DCFS rule limiting how long daycare assistants can monitor rooms of children under 2 years old. The bipartisan group urged for more information, but Republican State Senator Sue Rezin said they were misled.
These are two completely different pictures that were and information that was provided to this committee to justify why you are trying to enforce this rule.
Democratic State Representative Curtis Tarver said DCFS is a national embarrassment.
We don't come to you. I don't have to come to you for anything. You will need me before I need you. You need this committee before we need you. And this is a bipartisan disdain for your department.
After being further admonished by the committee, JCAR approved a motion objecting to the rules. In the second week of Illinois' gun ban registry, of more than 2.4 million firearm owner ID card holders, a total of 1,600 have disclosed that they own an item banned by the state. Numbers from Illinois State Police for the first week that opened October 1st showed 1,050 individuals disclosing around 3,200 items. For the second week, an additional 568 have filed for a total of nearly 4,700 items. Those with banned firearms not registered by January 1st could face criminal penalties. ISP has said that those who purchased firearms during the time there was an injunction against the law still won't be able to file a disclosure affidavit in compliance with the gun ban because they purchased such items after the law's enactment in January. State Senator Jason Plummer says that's wrong, and if the law is upheld by the courts, he's looking to pass a bill to hold those firearm owners harmless.
Not set them up to be penalized for doing what millions of people do, every year across the country.
Legislators return for 6 days of scheduled veto session starting October 24th. 3 public hearings will be conducted by Illinois State Police to hear comments and questions about the state's banned firearms registry. ISP said they'll schedule 2 hearings. One's already scheduled, and it'll take place at a Capitol Complex hearing room in Springfield that seats fewer than 100. Dan Eldridge with the Federal Firearms Licensees of Illinois said a small committee room for such a big issue makes no sense.
I expect that attendance at these hearings is going to be well in excess of what they could fit into that room. These rules are serious business. There's compliance risk for FFLs. There's compliance risk for manufacturers and customers, gun owners. We're talking about possible felony charges.
The Springfield hearing will be Thursday, November 2nd at 9:30 a.m. inside room D1 of the Stratton Building in Springfield. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom and liberty are important to all of us in Illinois, from Rockford to Carbondale, from Quincy to Decatur. If you're looking for civil, intellectual conversations with those shaping the future of freedom, try the Future of Freedom podcast with me, Scott Bertrand. We speak with leaders across the country in the greater conservative and libertarian movements. In-depth conversations about where the next intellectual battles will happen across the country. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau senior reporter and editor. How are you, Greg?
Dan, I am preparing as best I can for what could be a pretty intense fall veto session starting up next week, and news just has not slowed down heading into that final 6 days of session this year.
You have certainly got that right, and I can imagine next week it's going to be just as newsy, if not newsier.
Yeah, we've got a whole host of things that are going to be brought up, everything from energy policy to even the possibility of extending the Invest in Kids school choice scholarship program. So I imagine those are going to be some of the major items that we talk about next week. But before we even get there, we've got tons of things happening with government oversight of executive state agencies to the ongoing non-citizen migrant issue impacting taxpayers to even some action happening in the federal courts when it comes to the gun and magazine ban here in the state.
Well, why don't we start, Greg, with the story that you broke, just about an hour or so ago. First, let me tell readers that we are recording, or listeners, excuse me. If you're reading this, good for you. We are recording this on Thursday, October 19th. Greg, just a little bit ago, as I mentioned, you broke the story about the healthcare program for non-citizens, for those migrants who cross the southern border and have been bused here over the past year plus, more than 16,000 of them already, but plus there are also more non-citizens outside of those that have been just bused here in the past year, that the state is suspending new enrollees from the healthcare program because it's at or really close to capacity. Tell us about that.
So, yeah, just as some background on this, way back in 2020, which feels like forever ago, Dan, the State House brought about a policy as part of the budgeting process for the coming fiscal year in 2020 that would have allowed for non-citizen migrants to get subsidized health care coverage in the state of Illinois, subsidized by Illinois taxpayers, but for those only over the age of 65. And we were told back then, when we followed up with then state's representative, Delia Ramirez, who's now a U.S. Congresswoman in Chicago. She was the one spearheading this policy back then. She had said it's only going to be impacting several thousand people, and it would only cost taxpayers about $1.9 million. That was in 2020 with those over the age of 65. Then a couple of years later, the State House, as part of the budgeting process, opened that up to those over the age of 42 who are in this country as non-citizens. In Illinois, they would get taxpayer subsidized health care coverage. So they opened that up, and the estimated cost was, several $1 million. And then heading into fiscal year 2024, which started July 1st, if you recall, earlier this year, you had Republicans highlighting a audit that projected the cost of immigrant health care being subsidized by taxpayers in the state of Illinois would be around $1 billion of total cost. So when that number was brought up, you had heading into this coming fiscal year, which started July 1st this year, we're already in it, Governor J.B. Pritzker indicated that he's going to bring about some cost savings measures. That included copays and cost sharing with the service providers. And also, he said he was going to suspend the program for those over the age of 42 who are in this country as non-citizens from getting health care. So that was announced over the summer as the new budget started. Here we are now, 4 months into the fiscal year with a budgeted amount of $550 million for subsidizing the healthcare coverage of non-citizens over the age of 65. We're 4 months into it, and we've reached capacity practically of 16,500 enrollees. So the governor put that cap in place at the beginning of the fiscal year, saying if it comes up to 16,500 enrollees for those over the age of 65, the state's going to have to suspend new enrollees. Now, earlier this week, Dan, the Center Square reported that the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules heard from a attorney with the Department of Healthcare and Family Services that told the bipartisan committee that they can't put the copays in place right away. They can't put the cost savings measures and the cost sharing measures in place right away. They're still working with the federal government and with health providers to see how they can work that out. But 4 months in, they still can't put those cost saving measures in place. And they said maybe January 1st, but that's a maybe. But then they shared that so far, by October 10th, they said they've seen now 16,100 enrollees over the age of 65 as part of getting the taxpayer subsidized healthcare. So that was a bit of a forecast earlier this week on Tuesday. We wrote about that at the Center Square, Illinois, one of only few outlets that did. Definitely encourage people to follow us there if you want some of the latest breaking news stories. But you have the number of 16,100 reported, and that forecasted that we're looking to hit that cap of 16,500 real soon. Well, today, Thursday, as we record this just moments ago, the governor's administration announced that indeed in early November, they're going to be suspending enrollees for the 65 and over program because they're rapidly approaching that cap. Now, what this means, Dan, is taxpayers are still paying for this healthcare coverage. They just won't be taking in new enrollees. So those who are enrolled right now will still get coverage at taxpayer expense, but no new enrollees moving forward. So obviously, this is a story that's going to continue to evolve, especially, Dan, with the past 13 months, more than 16,000 non-citizen migrants hitting the streets in Chicago.
When Governor Pritzker this summer suspended the program for those non-citizens between the ages of 42 and 64, he got a lot of pushback on that, saying the state should be paying for health care for at least everyone over the age of 42. Now that he's suspending enrollment for those over 65, I would imagine he's going to get more pushback on that.
Yeah, and some of the groups that have been pushing for expanding healthcare coverage have been adamant, saying that there's federal tax dollars that are available to help offset these costs, but I don't think that they've been able to find those federal tax dollars to help offset the Illinois tax dollar being used for this. So while you've got people on the streets who may hold up a sign and say, we want this healthcare access, I think the governor recognized that there's only limited dollars they have in a state budget, and that's why they agreed to a $550 million cap and a cap of 16,500 enrollees and suspending the 42 and up program. But obviously those costs grew to a point where it triggered those mechanisms, so to speak, to suspend the program moving forward. Will the legislature address this during fall veto session? We'll see if there is the political will to tackle this issue.
Yeah, you've final closing point, Greg, on this topic, because we have other things we want to talk about. But you have written here that the possibility of a supplemental appropriations could come up during fall veto session, which, as you mentioned, starts next week. What that means is adding to the current fiscal 24 budget, adding spending. So this is one thing that taxpayers should be look to the centersquare.com for during you and the Illinois team's coverage next week of that veto session.
Absolutely.
Greg, Illinois Democrats and Illinois Republicans are constantly yelling at each other, it seems. But at a meeting this week, both Republicans and Democrats in a bipartisan hearing really turned their wrath on the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. Tell us what's going on there.
So the Department of Children and Family Services has been under the microscope for years because of various audit reports that come out highlighting the poor handling of policies when it comes to, reporting alleged abuse to the proper authorities in a timely fashion, to even, reports showing that children have been harmed or have lost their lives. Despite having some kind of contact with the Department of Children and Family Services. So obviously, the Child Welfare Agency in Illinois, very much in the spotlight. And we had the director, Mark Smith, announce several weeks ago that he was going to be retiring or resigning at the end of this calendar year. So they're going to have to find a new executive director. But that's just part of the overall issues that have been highlighted at DCFS. Separate from all of that is DCFS's role in licensing daycare centers. So a lot of professions in Illinois need some kind of licensure. If you're a doctor, if you're, even a landscape architect or a variety of dentists, they all have to go through this licensing process. And a lot of that's handled by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. DCFS, though, handles the licensing of child daycare centers. And this week, during a Joint Committee on Administrative Rules hearing, you had bipartisan legislators from the House and the Senate lash the Department of Children and Family Services over how they've handled the daycare licensing operations. The crux of this comes down to, Dan, that daycare operators, private operators of daycare facilities for children, have a problem getting staff who are qualified, according to DCFS, to monitor certain rooms of children. During the pandemic, some rules were relaxed to say that child care assistants who have a certain qualification can watch rooms of children under the age of 2 for 3 hours at the beginning of the day and 3 hours at the end of the day. That was opened up during COVID because of the emergency and the child daycare emergency that we all saw reported on, and we reported on as well at government.com.
Just if I could just jump in there, yeah. When the state shut down schools, in-person schooling went to fully remote, deemed non-business or businesses that were deemed non-essential were shut down anyway. Particularly with kids home from school. Parents who had jobs, who still had to go to their jobs, needed daycare. So that's sort of, to me anyway, that's when this whole daycare issue opened up, the lack of affordable daycare around the state. I'm sorry, can I interrupt you?
And that's good context. And I would imagine things were compounded even more as people began going back to the offices. They needed daycare offerings. But we hear about the daycare staff shortage, and this rule helped open that up. Well, once the public health emergency was lifted, DCFS went back to the old rule of only allowing these daycare assistants to monitor rooms for 90 minutes instead of 3 hours at the beginning and at the end of the day. So then they started enforcing that. Daycare operators saw this as a threat to their ability to offer the service because they didn't have the necessary qualifications that DCFS was looking for. And you had this all compounding. Over the summer, the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules suspended DCFS's rules. They voted, and it doesn't happen a lot, but this bipartisan group of legislators voted in a bipartisan fashion to suspend that DCFS rule, essentially saying that daycare operators could have assistants watch certain rooms of children for certain durations. But then in the process of all of that, the emergency rule turned into a permanent rule, and DCFS has said that they're trying to work with the stakeholders to get the right rule. The stakeholders, the daycare operators, saying that it's not working, and a lot of them feeling threatened as to how they're going to have to be forced to comply with these things or shut down and not offer these services. So obviously, the daycare operators and the legislators have been discussing this, and the daycare operators' feelings were expressed whenever you had Democrats and Republicans chastise the Department of Children and Family Services. Dan, they did not hold back. They said it's a national disgrace. The legislators from both parties said that DCFS should be embarrassed. Even one state legislator saying that she might have to legislate daycare operating licensing away from DCFS, maybe put it into the Department of Healthcare and Family Services, or maybe put it into the Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. But obviously, there was bipartisan frustration on full display in front of the Department of Children and Family Services hearing as part of the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules hearing earlier this week. This is not a story that's over, Dan. You've got the rule still in place and possible action from the legislature when it comes to whether or not DCFS is going to allow for certain daycare assistants with maybe a year's worth of experience to watch these types of rooms. But clearly, the daycare operators are looking for staff. They're looking for qualified individuals, but they feel pressured with the rule and how the rule's been crafted and whether or not they were actually part of the conversations of the rule. So a lot of frustrations on display earlier this week, Dan.
And final point for me, because I want to get to two more stories, Greg. In the aftermath of COVID, there were hiring issues before COVID in the daycare industry. Not an easy job, not a well-paid job. And then COVID hit, people were sent home, and that you had, remember the Great Resignation? People took a long time coming back to work. And I think there's still some of that here. So anything that hinders daycare operators from being able to accept more children from families that want to work, that want to go out and work, that's a greater issue than just, a single family not being able to find affordable daycare. It affects the economy as a whole, because if you don't have affordable daycare, there are certain people who aren't able to go get a job. Moving on, though, Greg, when Governor Pritzker first announced that he wants to have 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030, that goal, that target there was pushback against that, just because of how expensive electric vehicles are. Illinois didn't have the infrastructure in place. Of course, Governor Pritzker and the legislature put incentives in place for people to tax rebates for people who want to buy electric vehicles. That goal of 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030 is still in place. It's now coming to the close of 2023. We're only a few years away from 2030, and that goal is still getting pushed back. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of focus on alternative fuels, especially during the Pritzker administration. He's done a variety of things, not just pushing for a goal of 1 million EVs on Illinois roadways over a certain number of years. Remember, Dan, he has signed legislation years ago that says no more coal-fired power plants by 2040. And increasing the availability of solar power and wind power while trying to get rid of fossil fuels. And the governor said time and again that it's an effort to combat climate change. So part of this effort is obviously including incentivizing the creation of new markets for electric vehicles and battery storage. And there's tax credits for these different types of companies that come into Illinois to set up shop. If you recall, there's a lot of controversy around the Goshen plant in Kankakee that's moving forward despite opposition, that nearly $500 million of state tax credits would go to this Chinese-linked company in Kankakee County. But you've got other companies as well getting tax credits to set up either electric vehicle manufacturing facilities or battery facilities. But you also have the tax credits that are going and the rebates, rather, that are going to those who purchase EVs in Illinois. $19 million spent on the first round. They're looking at tens of millions of dollars more on the second round. But there's been criticism of those rebates because the rebates seem to be, it's been going to some high-end electric vehicles.
As usual, Greg, thank you for your insight into all of these important stories facing Illinois taxpayers. Listeners can keep up with all of them and more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.